I would like to welcome Dr. Branda Nowell. She's a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. In 2008, she co-founded the Fire Chasers Research Program aimed at advancing both the science and practice of adaptive capacity and network governance regarding wildfires in order to foster disaster-resilient communities. Dr. Nowell is an organizational community psychologist specializing in disaster response, network governance, interorganizational relationships, social networks, and multi-organizational systems designed with complex problem domains. Thank you so much, Dr. Branda Nowell, for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So the title of my talk that I wanted to give today is on co-managing wildfire conversations to have right now, and this was originally oriented from blog posts that we wrote at the very beginning of the fire season on trying to help communities and land agencies sort of gear up for moving into, I guess, what we call in the peak of fire season now, since we don't really have fire seasons, we have fire years now, but at least sort of the peak periods. But as we've continued with this research, these conversations have been reinforced for us as the ones that we need to be having right now as well. So I think the title remains probably contemporarily appropriate. Next slide, please, Liz. Before I jump in too much farther, I want to introduce my fantastic research team. It takes a village. So I founded this team back in 2008 with my research partner, Toddy Steelman, who is now at Duke University, and then we've added on Annalisa Velez, who's at Virginia Tech, as one of our co-PIs. And so the first phase of the work that we did was focused very heavily on the response phase of a wildfire, and particularly how the wildfire response and federal and state responses were integrating in with local level responses in terms of the emergency response and evacuations. And I know that's an area that is of some of the central work that folks on the call are doing. So all of that work is up on our website, firechasers.ncsu.edu. And I also want to introduce our fantastic team of graduate students that have been working with us on this most recent project, Kate, Sarah, Daisy, Honey, Elliot, and Ryan. This most recent project is a project funded through the Joint Fire Science Program, and so I want to give a shout out to our funders. They've been a really important supporter of this work, and it's really been focused more on the governance that exists in the land agencies themselves, and land agencies as well as private landowners, particularly large-scale commercial landowners, and sort of how we create these mega organizations, if you will, of fire response when the fire is moving across the landscape, affecting multiple jurisdictions. So go ahead and next slide, please. So the focal questions that I want to talk about today are really three. One, talking about how effective we are at managing multi-jurisdictional wildfire events, and we've got some data to share about that from the 2017 fires. And then talking about the challenges and tensions inherent in co-managing jurisdictionally complex incidents that we've learned from some fieldwork research last summer, as well as the 2017 fires, and the factors that appear to be promoting more effective co-management. So next slide. And I just want to situate this in terms of importance. So again, the focus here is on the response phase. And I know a lot of folks on the call do a lot of work in the mitigation efforts both before and after the fire. So preparedness, mitigation, those sorts of things. And we've really focused on the response phase and how we govern during a dynamic situation of a large-scale wildfire event. And, you know, over the past 12 years that I've been doing this work, you know, fires are getting larger. I don't remember, you know, in the last 5 years, a year that I haven't heard about quote unquote unprecedented fire behavior. It seems like every year the fires are moving faster, the fire behavior is less predictable. And because the fires are growing larger and faster, they are moving across and transversing across a greater number of jurisdictions. And so this creates some challenges because the response systems that we built to be able to respond to wildfires and disasters more generally get pushed pretty hard when you start bringing in multiple jurisdictions in terms of people that have authority over different areas of the fire. So this concept of co-management has been proposed, particularly at the national level, as a kind of focusing idea as an approach for achieving this more efficient and effective fire response. But as an organizational psychologist, one of the things we know from the lessons in change management more generally is that anytime you're trying to kind of introduce new ideas into old systems, sometimes there can be some friction points there. There's kind of a challenge in retrofitting. If you've ever done a renovation on an old house, it's kind of like that, where it seems like the blueprints as an overall look good, but once you actually start digging into the walls and figuring out how to link the stringers together, things can get a little wonky. So, there's this question about how do we retrofit these co-management ideas into the incident command system, which is organized around, this is the system that we use to coordinate response on complex wildfire incidents. And it tends to be a hierarchical command and control system organized around jurisdictional authority. And so when we've got multiple jurisdictions that have authority simultaneously, it really does get pushed a little bit in terms of what we have to work with. And so co-management is this concept of trying to create a power sharing relationship across jurisdictions. So we stop managing incidents at the jurisdictional level and we start managing incidents at the incident level. So what the incident is now and what it could potentially become. And this is a bit of a different approach to things. And so the question I think that becomes sort of a defining one for us is risk co-management among multiple jurisdictions possible given this governance structure that we're working with the incident command system? Next slide, please. So what have we been up to do this? We're going on actually a third phase right now. Back in 2017, we sampled out, I guess in 2018, we looked backwards at the fires of 2017 and sampled out 10 of the most jurisdictionally complex fires and conducted in-depth case studies with these. So these were fires focused on where we were interested in federal, state, local, and private interests that were involved. These were all type 1 project fires. There was a combination within the sample of the 10 fires that we looked at. Some were federally led fires and some were state-led fires. We tried to sample nationally to try and get a sense for what the national picture looked like. So 6 states traversing across 6 different geographic area coordinating centers. And so we conducted surveys and interviews with 88 agency administrators, agency administrator representatives, private representatives of large-scale landowners, so the largely commercial landowners, and so who would be sort of the AA equivalent for a private commercial landowner, as well as incident commanders that were involved on these incidents. And then in 2018, our team went out in the field and did observations on 3 jurisdictionally complex fires, 2 in Oregon, 1 in California, and now we are in the process of doing interviews similar to our phase 1 research, but on the 2018 fires with 5 fires, looking at contacting the folks who were AAs, ARs, private reps, and ICs on those fires. So we've basically been spending a lot of time bugging people on the phone, and some of you on the call may be folks we spoke with. So we're grateful to you for helping us with this project. So next slide, please. So the first question is basically like, how are we doing nationally at managing these multi-jurisdictional fires? So again, these are fires that light on one jurisdiction, and then because they become large, the fire doesn't really care where we draw the lines of boundaries, and so they're moving across federal lands, state lands, private lands, and then local municipal and county lands. And so go ahead, next slide, please. So the short answer to how we're doing on this is, well, it depends on who you ask. Go ahead, next slide. So to answer this question, we developed a 10-item scale that we call the Network Performance at Co-Management Scale, and this is available on our website, along with several other measures about network performance on complex wildfire incidents. And so this is a 10-item scale. I won't go through all of these items, but essentially asks about different sort of dimensions of co-management. So for example, the first one, a coordinated set of fire management objectives were agreed upon by all affected jurisdictions. So these are the types of things that if a fire is being managed well across jurisdictions that we would expect values to be high on in these. Go ahead, next slide. And so when we asked this across these, the 10 jurisdictionally complex fires in 2017, so our 88 different informants about this, what we learned is that it really, how well people think things went depends on who they were and the incident that they were referencing. And so in general, the pattern was that federal and local representatives tend to be the most positive about how things went on the co-management front, and state and private folks tended to be the least satisfied and the most critical about how things went on the co-management front. So, probably not particularly surprising, but important to know. Next slide, please. And what we found was across all of the different items that we asked about in terms of the 10-item scale, this item here was the one that was the most distinguishing across the jurisdictions. The overall strategy taken in managing this fire was appropriate. So as you can see here, 5 is most disagree. So the folks that were most critical about this item were the private and commercial folks, and the state folks, federal and local, were the most positive about this. So that was one of our, so this notion of the fire strategy is a key point on this. Next slide, please. But in interviews with these folks, despite all of these differences, which is something we might anticipate, what was important was that the challenges and the solutions were markedly similar regardless of the jurisdiction that folks represented. So basically, everyone kind of felt the same about this. If you were a receiving jurisdiction, if the fire was on one of your neighbor's land and you were a recipient of that fire and you felt like your interests and concerns were not taken into consideration, you didn't like it. And that didn't matter whether it was a, fire lit on a state jurisdiction moving to federal jurisdictions, or on federal jurisdictions moving to state jurisdictions, or in the private jurisdictions. It really didn't matter. That the dynamics were very similar, and so that's helpful. Next slide, please. And so really, if we kind of crack that egg open and look at the dynamics that are present, there's kind of a formula that's a structural formula. And so, oftentimes these things create a lot of conflict, and this conflict starts to feel very interpersonal and interorganizational, but really it's structural. And what we're dealing with here is sort of a structural conflict, that we've got jurisdictions that are adjoined to each other geographically. So they're conjoined at the hip. They literally can't get rid of each other. And because fire is easier to start and stop at certain points and places, there's an interdependency that exists between these jurisdictions. So how fire gets managed on one jurisdiction is going to have implications for the fire that may come onto another jurisdiction. So we've got some functional interdependency there. But these different jurisdictions have different objectives, and they have different priorities in terms of what it is that they're managing for on their both land management objectives and therefore fire management objectives. But the way that we manage fires jurisdictionally allows for each jurisdiction to sort of unilaterally make decisions about how to manage fires on their land. And so we've seen this in the environmental domain for a long, long time in a lot of different areas. Anytime you've got interdependence mixed with competing objectives and unilateral decision-making, you generally get a situation of conflict. I call it the conflict cocktail. And this is just a structural reality when you have these three pieces in play. Next slide, please. But because it works as this equation, I'm sorry that for some reason that graphic turned out all wonky there, but it works a little bit like a fire triangle. It's an equation. So if you solve, if you reduce one of these factors down to 0, the conflict goes away. You multiply anything by 0 and it goes to 0. So if you reduce the interdependence, for example, by creating buffer zones between the boundaries, then the conflict tends to get reduced or it can go away entirely. If you increase alignment of objectives, so that folks are not are managing things at sort of a Fireshed level as opposed to a jurisdictional level, and those objectives are transitioned across the across jurisdictions, then the conflict goes away. And if you share the decision space so that the folks feel represented in the decision, then the conflict is reduced or goes away. So those are kind of our points of leverage. The problem is that most of these points of leverage are not available to us during an actual fire event. So, increasing alignment of objectives, you don't really want to be negotiating objective alignment in the middle of a firefight. And again, reducing jurisdictional independence by creating boundary areas, not really a feasible option during the middle of a firefight. So a lot of this work is really critical in terms of the stuff that you guys are doing now in the local communities and the community wildfire protection plans, and sort of working with jurisdictions to sort of try and see if we can reduce some of the disparities in terms of jurisdictional interdependence or alignment of objectives ahead of time. But during the incident itself, really the point of leverage that we have available to us is sharing the decision space. That's, folks need to feel like they are represented in that decision space in order to feel okay oftentimes if they become affected by the incident. So next slide, please. So that's led to these 3 points of conversations that we feel like the Fireshed. And when I say Fireshed, what I mean is all of the contiguously conjoined jurisdictions that are linked together. So where a fire, fire is going to sort of move in semi-predictable ways based on some both man-made and natural barriers. And so oftentimes that Fireshed is going to be a lot larger than any one jurisdiction. It's going to encompass multiple jurisdictions. And so, where any one fire goes within that Fireshed on any one year may vary quite a bit, but ultimately, there's sort of a collective Fireshed. And you guys, who do this work are all familiar with this. You've seen these fires move through these areas. Locals can always tell me, where fires are going to go and where they're most likely to start up. And so we have sort of an implicit understanding of the Fireshed, but we don't govern. We don't structurally govern at a Fireshed level. And so that's what our team has been working a lot, particularly with federal land agencies as well as state land agencies, in trying to build capacity to govern at a Fireshed level. And so as starters, so the low-hanging fruit, sort of the bare minimum of this is we oftentimes get on fires and, the forest supervisor and the state, fire director have never met each other, don't know each until they're actually coming together in an agency administrator's tent, trying to come up with some shared objectives to provide a clear delegation of authority to an incident commander. That is not the time to have the introductory conversations if you can help it. And so, one of the things we're hoping happens is that all, jurisdictions get out the map and look at everyone that's around them in terms of other jurisdictions. And if they don't know who the sort of agency administrator equivalent would be in that jurisdiction, that they go find that out and they introduce themselves and start building that relationship and learning something about who your neighbors are. And in some ways, this is really just about learning to be a good neighbor, right? This is just kind of neighborhood politics, if you will. So introduce yourself. Make sure people know who you are and you know who they are. There needs to be a conversation about how and when folks are going to communicate with each other about potential threats. We've found this on multiple incidents that nothing communicates or puts people, I guess, on edge and is interpreted as disrespect as when they perceive a threat coming from another jurisdiction and they have to go hunt for information and hunt to find out what's going on, and that they feel like they're being excluded and not gaining easy access to information. So really outreaching to the people, anybody that may be perceiving threat from a fire that's not on their jurisdiction yet, but maybe developing some concerns about it. If there's a smoke column in the air, making sure to be proactive in what that communication is. It's a low cost, high payoff tactic for making sure that if the fire does make a run towards that jurisdiction, that those folks feel like I think part of what it does is it just says, we see you, we know you're out there, we're managing for our own concerns right now, but we also know that you have concerns, and we recognize that you're there, and we're keeping you in mind. And I think that's, in terms of, again, this is just being a good neighbor. That goes a huge a long way. And then the last one here, I know I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap it up here, but is how do we communicate concerns and offer assistance when we perceive a significant threat from a fire that's on your jurisdiction? And this one is tough because in the incident command system, there's kind of a pay-to-play logic to it. And unless you're on fire, you don't have a formal role within the fire organization. And so there's a lot of really creative work that's going on across the nation right now in trying to change practices and develop strategies for bringing in people that would be essentially potential AAs or potential, if it's a private commercial folks, like bringing folks in early to let them know what's going on and to be able to have a voice in some of the decision making that's potentially happening before the fire ever gets onto their land, and that we've seen some really positive outcomes with that kind of work. So with that, I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and hand it back over to Emily.